Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Country Education Partnership Professional Development Summer Series. This is the second of the current three-part series. My name is Brendan Ryan. The Country Education Partnership acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which our schools, our families, and our communities work and play. We pay our respects to elders of the past, the present, and those that will lead us into our collective future. So good afternoon, everybody. Today's format will involve a question and answer segment with the Deputy Secretary of Education, followed by two presentations involving CEP programs, and then I think we'll have time to come back and have some more question and answers segment following those presentations. Mark, hand over to you to explain what's happening with the current CEP activities.
Thanks, Brendan. At the moment, our focus is certainly heading towards the Energy Breakthrough Festival held in Maryborough in a few weeks' time, and we look forward to a short video halfway through today's session from Nigel Preston. And as our team get around the state, staffing for next year is certainly one of the significant issues that is coming up. And and our Teach Rural program involving placing rural students. We have a program beginning in Bairnsdale. We're putting 15 pre-service teachers all into the Bairnsdale area in a couple of weeks' time. So that's really exciting for that area and the schools around there. And we're busily setting up for next year. So I've been in Gippsland this week, securing the signatures of all the principals who are happy to have some pre-service teachers in their school next year. So that's our work in the last week. Brendan, back to you.
Thanks, Mark. Some housekeeping as usual. The session will take exactly 1 hour, so we'll conclude the session at 5 p.m. The program is being recorded, so there is an opportunity to review the session at your own leisure. All of the past programs are online, and if you'd like to have a look at some of our past sessions, they're certainly available. If during today's session someone has a question, could they please include it in the chat box? We have a number of prepared questions, but if we have the opportunity, we will respond to any additional questions in the chat box. And a reminder that before anybody finishes their session, could they please complete the survey for today's activity. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the Deputy Secretary of School Education Programs and Support. Stephen Fraser brings an outstanding record of educational leadership to the role as Deputy Secretary, and I hope Stephen doesn't mind. I'll just briefly go through some of his leadership opportunities that he's held previously. He initially started off with an honours degree at Monash University, majoring in language and literature. He joined the Education Department in 2010 as the Manager of Stakeholder Relations and Partnerships. In 2011, he was the Manager of Strategic Analysis. In 2012, Director of Performance and Accountability. In 2014, Executive Director of School Reform. In 2015, the Director of the Office of the Secretary. 2016, Executive Director of Implementation. And then in 2018, he became the Regional Director for Southwest Victoria. He then went to England for a couple of years. He was Director of International Partnerships in 2017 and Deputy CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation in 2019, and then returned to Victoria in July 21 to become the Deputy Secretary and has been in that role ever since. So that's certainly an outstanding record of leadership. So thank you very much, Stephen, for providing the opportunity here today for people to ask you questions. We're delighted to have you involved. And I wonder, before we ask Mark to start on the questions, could you perhaps briefly explain your current role as the Deputy Secretary? Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Brendan, and I'll add my acknowledgements of country to your words earlier, and just acknowledge that I'm joining you all from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge all emerging leaders across Victorian communities. It is a real pleasure to be with you all, and thanks to those able to carve out time in their day today, and to those who are perhaps watching this on replay. It's just an honour to have some of your time and be able to have this conversation and answer your questions. And thanks to the CEP for organising. So my role at the moment, as Brendan said, I'm Deputy Secretary for School Education Programs and Support, and work as part of the Executive Board of the Department, supporting fundamentally students and staff and leaders in our schools and communities. My particular responsibilities at the moment extend across our mental health and wellbeing reforms. So the mental health practitioners, mental health in primary schools, the fund and the menu, disability inclusion, all of our inclusion reform work and support funding, the Tier 2, Tier 3 funding for students with disabilities. Our career outcomes division and all of the work building from the Marung strategy fundamentally, and the campfire conversations that are helping feed into our self-determination approach. And then on to our statewide programs and tech schools team, which supports our camp sports excursions fund, our school uniforms program, our partnership with State Schools Relief, Glasses for Kids, and then our tech schools, which extends into specifically some of our rural and regional work. The Blended Learning Hub in Morwell, for instance, is part of that team, as well as swimming in schools and things like the State Schools Spectacular. And then just as a final piece on the cake, the International Students Program as well. So a wide-ranging portfolio, but really I think our work is about equity and excellence, ensuring that we tackle some of those access barriers and then ensure that we don't stop there. We think about the excellence that all students should be entitled to experience. Thanks, Brendan.
Thanks, Stephen. Now over to Mark for the questions. Thanks,
Brendan. I'm sure you're busily working out a swimming in schools question, as I didn't have any of them come in. Thanks, Stephen. And look, I'll preface the questions by acknowledging that you have your areas you're responsible for, and we may ask you things that are more general to the department, and we just, if you can just answer the best you can, I'm sure you will. That's fine with us, but we fully understand you may not have the intricate detail for every area. Lovely to see Clorinda on board too. I haven't seen her for a few months, so wonderful. Happy to kick off, Stephen.
Perfect.
I'm just going to start with a real generic one to start with. So, what initiative delivered in the last couple of years are you most pleased with, and which one do you think might have the biggest impact for rural schools?
Thanks, Mark. Look, I'm going to give a two-part answer to this, partly because when I reflect on the last 2 years, and as Brendan said, I came back to Victoria mid-2021, so right in the middle of, I think, what was Melbourne's 5th lockdown, so into hotel quarantine and all the rest of it. So a very COVID-affected environment. And it's difficult not to think of those years and the impact of schools over that period in Victoria's history. And I think it's easy to forget that schools in themselves are an initiative. The provision of public education as an intervention in children's lives, I think, is one of the most important things that we do. So when I think about the impact over the last 2 years, I think schools' continuity of operation in the face of all of those challenges and adversity, and being that absolute anchor and despite the disruptions to schooling, it kept going. Teachers kept coming, the leaders kept leading, and that is the role that schools play in communities, that point of stability and continuity. And I think the exposure that many families and parents in particular, and businesses to an extent, experienced into the workings of schools, I think is some of the, was one of the major shifts in community understanding of education and the impact that it can have in children's lives. So I think that I don't want to overlook that as one of the major things that happened in the last 2 years. So I'll start there, but then perhaps more to the patch that I've got responsibility for. I think increasingly, and it is anchored to that COVID context, probably the work that the department's done in partnership with schools in terms of mental health reform. Now, I don't think for a second that we have solved all of the mental health challenges that exist for students and young people at the moment. But I think the work that was happening before the Royal Commission, the work that has been really leveraged from the Royal Commission, and the extent to which that's privileged the needs in regional and rural communities, I think has been a real standout for me. So the acknowledgement of the Royal Commission that the mental health needs of students and communities was more acute in regional areas, the access to services and staff in particular was more pressing, and then the prioritisation of access to the mental health fund and menu in rural and regional schools, that's where I think I'm really proud of that work, and I think it's likely to have a big impact. Now, there's more to do, particularly in terms of access to staff and those services, but there is a lot of really good work happening, and I think particularly clustering arrangements between schools, we're starting to see some of that come together. So for me, looking back on the last 2 years, it is that combination of the continuity and stability of schooling despite all the challenges, and then that real investment in and prioritisation of rural and regional schools in the mental health space.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm glad you said that, because that was what I was hoping you would say was one of the most important initiatives. So probably because I have a passion in that area too. So next one we got a fairly general one. This is from John Wilson, Carramburra Secondary. What are we doing to solve the long-term staffing crisis?
With the long-term staffing crisis, I think is a bigger game. We're in a period where the Commonwealth government have hit the pause button on the National School Reform Agreement. We're in a year of review at the moment. We've got the expert panel. We've also had the national panel on teacher education and recruitment. We've got some reforms coming there, but I think it's important to reflect on that as the long-term plan, because that is where the bulk of additional funding is going to come into Victorian schools through that national agreement. We know that we're short of 100% of the school resourcing standard at the moment, and that pathway to 100% is where the bulk of the funding is going to come into the system. And I think we need to absolutely look at the funding to solve the staffing challenges, because making teaching the most attractive profession it can possibly be. Now, funding isn't the only part of that, but it is a big part of that, alongside the workload challenges and alongside the professional learning and development and collegiality aspects. I think we need to look at all of those together. Now, we have some short-term and maybe medium-term investments in place. We know we've got attraction and retention initiatives. Government's invested significant amounts of money both in attracting and retaining teachers in rural and regional areas, and particularly to teaching roles. The waiving of university fees for secondary education, is part of that initiative. So I think there's lots of investment underway, and part of that has been, through consultation with CEP. We know that we've got 27 million in the targeted financial incentives to attract teachers to rural and regional areas and hard to staff positions. That's been, in large part through the advocacy of CEP and others, but there's more to go. So I think looking at the impact of those initiatives that are in place at the moment, I would call them kind of short to medium term. The long term, we need to look at that national agreement and the future funding that's going to come into our schools as we work towards that 100% SRS loading and the extent of that to which that can be used to attract and retain our most talented teachers.
Thanks, Stephen. Just in the same category, and I guess I'll preface this question by saying that we understand in any career or vocation, there's always going to be people who leave the profession within a certain time period. It's natural. But Rob Boucher at Swiss Creek is interested to know whether we know why teachers exit the profession in their first 5 years. Do we know some of the reasons?
Yeah, look, we do, and a lot of that is based on some fairly robust research and longitudinal research that's tracked those reasons over a fairly extensive period of time, and in large part, it's a combination of lifestyle choices. We all know that the first years in any career are an opportunity to assess the decisions that we've made and really determine, is this the right role for me? But also for teachers in particular, a lot of the reasons reported by teachers who do leave the profession, rather than just those who might plan to leave, really come down to the collegiate support and the professional support. We know when there's good mentoring in place, good guidance and support for when things aren't going quite right, and I need that additional experience to draw from a colleague who's been down that path before. We know when teachers feel professionally supported, they feel like they're part of a team and really engaged in their school, then they're more likely to stay in the profession. So it is where we see not only at a whole of system level when we have those supports in place, and again, we've had investment in mentoring and support relationships for some time now, but that's not only at the system level, but at the school level. When teachers start their career in a school with really strong induction programs and really strong support for graduates in their first couple of years, and really helping them to learn the ropes and feel accomplished in their profession as they move from novice to more expert levels of skill, then that increases the likelihood that a teacher's going to want to stay, not only in the profession, but in that particular school. So I think we can be pretty confident about the reasons why, and when that's not happening, the lifestyle choices, there's not a lot we can do about, but we can absolutely do a lot about that professional support that's in place.
Thanks, Stephen. And we had some pre-service teachers on one of these sessions last term, and interesting enough, they actually said the same things if you just said, that as their reason to choosing a school, because it certainly is a buyer's market at the moment. So, as well as your data on that keeps them in the job, that also attracts them to a school in the first place. So that's great. We're going to hop to a bit of a scenario for you now. So if you were speaking to a group of senior secondary students over morning tea, what would be your pitch in regards to teaching in a Victorian government school?
Look, I would probably start with that collegiate support. And I think particularly for rural and regional schools, it's not just the collegiate support that exists within the school, but it's the surrounding network of schools, that cluster arrangement and belonging to a system. I remember a conversation a few years ago, a former colleague and I went out to one of the larger non-government schools in Melbourne. I won't name the school, but I suspect a lot of non-government schools are like this. And we asked, where do you get your support and challenge from? And their answer was basically overseas schools. They operate as part of a global network. The school down the road is their competitor. And I think it was such a shame and kind of you know, professional isolation is bad enough for teachers in any role, particularly those in rural and regional schools. If you're in a school that doesn't have another school that you can draw from and get that support and challenge, then that must be so isolating. And I think government schools are in the incredibly powerful position of not having to do that. There is always a school, might be a fair way up the road, but there is always a school up the road that's willing to hop on the phone, or in some cases, hop in the car and drive down and be part of that journey. I think of the Pyrenees cluster, for instance, and the absolute collaboration in the interests of students in that community, whether it's combining music lessons, combining sports events, whilst teachers are engaging in their professional learning together. That is an asset and a strength that exists in the government school system that is not available in many other systems. So I think if we come back to that response earlier and what you heard from the graduates around that collegiality, that professional support, it exists in the government school system in a way that it doesn't exist in other sectors. And I think that is one of the major attractions and strengths of our system.
Thanks, Stephen. The next one might put you on the spot a little bit. Over the last few years, it often gets raised with CEP, where we have groups of very small schools in the same vicinity-ish. We're just wondering if it's ever been considered the idea of having one principal, an exec principal model over 3 or 4 schools, and then a local leader at whatever level on the ground, whether that model has ever been considered or could ever be considered into the future.
Yeah, I think it's worth further exploration, and like all these things, there are decision-making processes, and I think taking a proposal to a minister, would be an absolute necessity. I think of some existing hub and annex arrangements that we've got that are not dissimilar to that, but that typically involves 1 to 2 other schools. So I think the short answer is probably yes, we should be open to exploring that further. The wrinkle, if I'll call it that, this is not unsolvable, but I think we would absolutely have to address it, is the school leaders on this call and listening to this conversation, you absolutely matter to your local communities. And I think having a school principal who I know is the person who is leading my local school, the value of that label, that title, the value of that position to the local community is really, really important. And so doing it in a way that we could hold true to that trusted relationship that a community has with its local principal, may be supported by an executive principal, but still keeping the title of school principal. In some ways, these are just words, but they're words with depth and history and meaning that I don't think we can just skip over. So I think designing such a pilot in a way that makes sure that every community still feels like it has a local principal would be really important.
And in the Pyrenees cluster you mentioned earlier, there's great examples of 2 schools who both got down to 3 students in the last 10 years, and now both between 12 and 16. So with principals with energy and passion and want to deliver quality education. So it's interesting, and through this PD Online series, Stephen, there are many outstanding principals who we would love to hear about, but they're also very humble. So we'd almost need to get teachers from their school to come and talk about them. So it's certainly very much the Australian way, I guess, to not, they're just busy out there doing the job.
The Australian way and the educator's way. I think every teacher, every leader knows that it's rarely their efforts alone that have built the learning outcomes for students. It's always a team effort. But that said, we do have some who are exceptional, and encouraging them to step forward. I was really pleased this year. I think we saw a more diverse group of schools nominated and as finalists for the Victorian Education Excellence Awards. That's increasing each year. We're seeing more diversity, more nominations coming through, but we do really need to encourage our colleagues and others to step up and put themselves forward, because that's, I think, one of the ways, it's not the only way, but one of the ways that we can really celebrate that outstanding practice, the excellence of outcomes in the system.
That certainly was a great night, and there were many rural schools nominated and some winners there. So we were very excited to have 2 CEP board members receive awards.
Yep.
Just the next question from Rob Boucher again, Swiss Creek. Given the work David Howes did 3 years ago around rural education, how is the department supporting schools to meet the challenge of changed economic activity and its flow-on effects for schools?
Yeah, I'd reference, Mark, that investments that I talked through before. Since the expert panel delivered its report, we have seen multiple budgets commit to many of those initiatives. So if I think about the curriculum access coordinators that support the clustering arrangements, which again that was recommitted to in the last budget, those 8 positions across the regions. I mentioned the 27 million in the targeted financial incentives. We've had another 32 million to support pre-service teachers to undertake placements in rural and regional schools. We then had the investment I mentioned before into the regional blended learning hub in Morwell, and then some of the the academy is the other one. Again, strongly linked to David's report, and the 7 physical sites for the academy across regional and rural areas. So there's been investment. I think the challenge has been that those economic conditions have not changed, and in some cases they've been exacerbated by COVID, cost of living crisis, and what we're seeing in terms of interest rates and some of the industry changes. So I think lots has been done. A lot has been done, and the investment is made. But some of those initiatives are still quite new. So if we think about the academy, for instance, we're really just seeing the teaching excellence program and some of the delivery in rural locations really starting to hit its strides. Likewise with the regional blended learning hub, it's a single model that we hope to learn from, and then that could then in turn be expanded to other areas to expand curriculum access for students in rural and regional areas. So a lot has been done since that report, but the economic conditions haven't really changed, and in some cases they've worsened. So I think a lot has been done. There is more to come.
Thanks, Stephen. We've just got time for one more, and then we'll give you a break, give your throat a break, which is in much better condition than it was a few weeks ago, I will say. You've recovered well. I find this question interesting because this is one you could certainly be asking back to CEP, but anyway, for this session, it's to Stephen Fraser. So a middle level leader tells you they're considering applying for a role as a small school principal. What advice would you give to them?
I think my first advice would be go for it. I think you'll never know unless you try. And the addendum to that advice would probably be pretty explicit about building your network. I touched before on professional isolation. It is something that's been written about extensively. We know that teaching is a lonely profession. Leading, once you close that classroom door and you spend most of your day with children and adolescents, your interaction with other adults is, it's pretty sporadic, and leading a school is even more, or can be even more, professionally isolating. So I think be very deliberate and explicit about structuring, building your professional networks and your engagement with colleagues. Because if you don't do it deliberately, you will find yourself, pretty alone. And I think particularly coming out of the teaching profession into a leadership role, it is very easy to be isolated. And I think, obviously that's where CEP plays a really strong role in helping maintain and build those connections between rural school leaders. The other point I'd make is just, we don't really have, aside from pre-service placements, we don't have good apprenticeship models in education. And I think just thinking about that opportunity to lead in a small rural school, it is often used across our system as a platform to future leadership roles in larger schools, different environments. And I think, again, being explicit about this is something I'm going to use as an experience to learn from. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to lead this community, lead this group of students and teachers. But I'm also going to learn from the experience and think about how I might draw from that in future career changes.
Thanks, Stephen. And I know shadowing programs of the past have been greatly successful for those principals who participated. Interestingly enough, I remember one of the series when I think half the applicants had left halfway through to take up an acting role. That's the trouble. The need outweighs the number interested at the moment. So we'll give you a break. We'll pass back to Brendan, and we're going to hear about a couple of our programs, and then come back to you for the last 15 minutes. Thank you. You're on mute, Brendan.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Thank you. We're going to hear about a couple of the CEP programs. The first one is the Energy Breakthrough Program. That event's at Maryborough from the 22nd to the 26th of November this year. And I'm pleased to introduce Nigel Preston, who is the Education Team Leader for Energy Breakthrough. And I did note there, Nigel, that you started your involvement with the program in 1998. So you've been a participant, you've volunteered, and you've been part of the management of the program. So that's been outstanding service. So thanks very much for being with us today. I'll hand over to you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Brendan. And thank you, Stephen and Mark, for what you've had so far in the conversation. We will just show a quick video, hopefully, if technology allows, and then I will say a few words after that.
Nope, just no sound at my end.
The beauty of technology. So this will talk through some of the things. So we do have robotics. Now we have a junkyard challenge. Oh, you can keep playing it if you like. That's all right. I'll just speak over it. And push carts as well. So it's a continuum right from primary school right up through secondary school with pedal-powered vehicles and electric vehicles as well. And so I love what Stephen was saying about it being about equity and excellence, because we really do take all sorts. So there's these assessment aspects of the program, if you're not familiar. So the students have to get up and present to judges. Might be the only public speaking they do in their school. Design and construction, where they talk about what they've built, their construction, and then trials. They trial what they've built in action, which is a race component. And that's worth 50% of their score. So some of those activities just last a few minutes, and the secondary teams compete for 24 hours overnight. And there's lots of thrills and spills and activities along the way. So this is happening in 2 weeks. As Brendan said, it's been going for quite a long time, since 1991 was the first one. CEP were actually the founder of the initiative, and that organisation or this organisation took it to Maryborough, which is in central Victoria, and we're really pleased to have 93 schools at the moment coming to Maryborough. So I think one of the biggest sort of camping outdoor activities of schools, and all across the state, from Great Western Primary School, Eden Hope, across to Catamatite, Currumborough, St Arnaud's, all over the state, including your Bendigos, your Ballarats, and lots of metro schools as well. And we set the program up with some challenges, as I said there in that video, from robotics right through to electric vehicles, and basically say, there's the challenge, and schools can participate and grapple with that challenge. So some schools do it as part of their class, some do it as an after school activity, some do it as a after hours or weekend activity. There's all sorts of different ways that schools tackle the initiative, because fundamentally all schools are different. There's no single sort of proposition that you can broadly say everyone will do it this way, and we kind of like it that way. It's kind of much more raw and organic that way. So there's rural schools, regional schools, metro schools, state, independent, Catholic, specialist, all on site for 4 days in Maryborough in a couple of weeks. And so it's a program I'm really passionate about. I've been visiting schools recently, seeing what the students are up to, and there really is everything from students who literally would not be at school any longer if it wasn't for this program. It's what the hook is for them to stay in school, right through to VCE level, where they're working with lithium batteries, carbon fiber, titanium machining products that are really world-leading sort of stuff. So it really is impressive to see. So CEP, we're hosting some tours. So if you're interested at all, please get in touch with us and seek it out. There's obviously the video, which you can watch with sound and not my narration, which is much more exciting. But yeah, really it is something exciting, and we're passionate as part of CEP to be effectively the host of the organisation and the initiative. So thanks, Brendan and Mark. I tried to be snappy, so back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. It's a wonderful program, highly recommended to all schools. Thank you for your work. Now, the second program we'd like to highlight today is the Teach Rural program. The Teach Rural program supports groups of pre-service teachers to undertake placements at clusters of rural and regional government schools in Victoria. And I'll now introduce Susan Jackson, Program Manager, who looks after the Teach Rural program, and ask Susan to provide a snapshot of the program. Over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Brendan. Like Brendan just said, Teach Rural is a pilot program that offers pre-service teachers, or PSTs as we call them, the opportunity to have a really well-supported placement and being part of a rural school in a rural community. The clusters, we try to get groups of a minimum of 3. Like Mark said earlier on, we've got Bairnsdale coming up in a couple of weeks, at which we've got 15 down there together. We find that less than 3 doesn't work as well for their professional learning and their the collegiality and the learning together. But from 3, 4, 5, it works really, really well. We had a number of clusters down the Otways areas earlier on in the year. They worked really well. We had them as 5s and 7s, which was excellent. CEP works with the Department of Education, which is where the funding comes from, the universities and the schools, to ensure the cluster placements are very well supported and organised. And we aim, or CEP aims, to take a lot of those organisational burdens from the school and make sure that everything's in place and goes quite seamless through their placement. The program fully funds the PST's accommodation, which has been a big issue in the past, and it's been very, very much appreciated by the students to have that accommodation funded, because what we've found in the discussion with the students, that if they go off on placement and have to rent a place, also rent where they're already staying, and then they lose their ability to work as well. It's like a triple hit for some of them, which they just can't afford, and that's often the reason why they don't go on placements in rural areas. CEP also puts a wellbeing mentor in place for each cluster to ensure that any issues outside their academic are well supported and solved early on in the piece if there are issues. We've had very few issues, but I think it's because there's so many supports in place, and it's so the students are so well supported that any issues that might bubble up are solved pretty quickly. We also support a welcome event, which welcomes the students into the school and meets all the teachers at the school as a rule, and meets the other students. The feedback from that is that that's very well received because they feel like they belong, and that they're not just sort of someone sitting there in the staff room that most people don't even know who is there a lot of the time, whereas if they all get together for the welcome event, they're well welcomed. We also have a peer networking event, which is where we gather all the students in the cluster and take them on a day, and it usually involves learning about the local area, perhaps sometimes learning about small businesses and that the feedback from that has also been very positive because the students have said that they've learnt to understand the rural area much better rather than just being in the school and then leaving. And generally the students stay for the weekend. Some have joined in watching students play football celebrations, a whole range of things rather than just dropping in for their placement and leaving again. The final thing that CEP funds through the program is a leadership and a PST dinner at some stage through their placement, and that's also well received. Next, we've got a video for you to watch. This video was developed with DE, the Department of Education, earlier this year following a cluster of students placed in St Arnaud area. Thank you.
Oh, looks like we might not have the video.
Yeah, it seems like the video might have a little bit of an issue at the moment. I'll just look into it and I'll be 2 seconds.
Okay, if we get a chance to see that, we might stop there.
We can just blame it on Optus, Mark. It's okay.
That's right. So I think we'll move back to the question and answer segment, if that's all right, Stephen. And
we can keep chatting.
Yes, perhaps, Mark, if you're happy, I'll ask the next question.
Go for it.
Stephen, recently the Disability Royal Commission report was made available to the media and the community. This is an area of very great interest to me because I do have a daughter with disability. The commissioners appear to be divided regarding the future of special schools in Victoria. In fact, some of the commissioners appear to want to reintegrate students with disabilities back into the traditional school settings. So I guess I'm asking, as a result of the report, is the department intending to review the current special school structure in any way? And what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Brendan. Obviously, yeah, it is a question that's close to many people's hearts. Clearly not only families of children with disability, but schools, teachers, leaders, education support staff, those who are charged with the education and care of students with disability, and has received quite a bit of commentary in a way that I worry at times distracts from the other recommendations and the other findings in that report. Obviously, it was an extensive piece of work that was, again, affected by COVID, and so many families and those with lived experience of disability really gave generously of their own experiences and stories to inform that Royal Commission. And I hope it's this one split recommendation doesn't overshadow the rest of the work of the commissioners and those families and people who contributed. So in terms of this, the split recommendation, and commissioners were divided on their views about the future of specialist schools. The department will feed in advice to government. The Department for Families, Fairness and Housing is the lead department in Victoria with responsibility for government's overall response to the report, and governments have been asked to provide a response by March next year. So we'll contribute to that process. Alongside that, I think, and to be really transparent, we obviously work a lot with the Principals Association of Specialist Schools, and are quite close to what specialist school principals are hearing from their staff, from their communities. And there is, since the report was handed down, there's a bit of anxiety amongst the parent communities in particular, and schools about, well, what does that mean for the future of specialist schools? I think what we can be very, very confident of in Victoria is the backing that this government has given specialist schools. We are building more specialist schools, so that in itself is a firm commitment. Our disability inclusion reform program clearly positions specialist schools at the heart of those reforms. So the inclusion outreach coaches, for instance, are very deliberately about drawing from the expertise, that really specialist knowledge and skill that sits within specialist schools, and making that more accessible to non-specialist schools, and particularly to the benefit of students with disability who are attending their local neighbourhood school. So the place of specialist schools within the Victorian government school system is really embedded. And then finally, prior to the last election, we saw a really strong commitment to the place of specialist schools in our system through what the government termed the Fighting for Students with Disabilities and Their Families package, which includes the intensive outside school hours care program. It includes the NDIS navigators. It includes a review of eligibility criteria for specialist schools. So a whole range of reforms that are clearly focused on specialist schools being a future part of our system. So we're working with government at the moment, as I said, to formulate that response to the Royal Commission's report. But I think we can be very confident that specialist schools and all of their expertise and the support they provide will be a critical part of our system going forward. The other thing I'll say is just on the recommendation itself, you know, we know that it's really about the expertise that contributes to an inclusive education system, and building that across the board. And I think that's where we would, you know, as a department, and this is, you know, true to the disability inclusion reforms and those system reforms that focus on building capability through the Masters of Inclusive Education and the graduate diploma in specialist education that have been funded and supported. It's about building staff expertise in meeting the learning needs, and particularly diverse learning needs of students right across the system. So that inclusive education agenda is unchanged, and, you know, the Royal Commissioner's recommendations won't change that. Our challenge is really about inclusivity right across the system. And we know already that 55% of students with disability in Victoria attend mainstream settings. It's actually a minority of students with disability attending specialist settings, but they are, you know, those with high and intensive needs, where specialist skills are required, and that support parent choice. So, you know, I think that's really what we've heard and seen from many families at the moment, that that ability to make the choice that best meets the learning and wellbeing of their children is something that's most valued. And for some, that's a mainstream local neighbourhood school. For others, it's a specialist setting.
Thank you, Stephen. That your response is very reassuring. Mark, did you want to proceed with the next question?
Thanks, Stephen. We have quite a few P12 and K12 schools across rural Victoria, and the principals of those schools sometimes feel a bit like a fish out of water, that their needs are quite unique, and sometimes they feel like they're not being met or heard. They're quite keen to form an alliance together to have that collective voice about issues specific to them. Do you see a role for such a group, and do you think the department would be keen to engage with a P12 alliance?
I'll give a really short answer to this one, Mark, because I had the opportunity to test this one with David Howes before this session. SRS, Schools and Regional Services, are in the process at the moment of setting up a P9 network, and David's really open to inviting interest from P12s to form a similar network. So I think it's possibly a conversation between David's team and CEP about how best to facilitate that. But yeah, no reason why not.
Wonderful. Back to you, Brendan.
Stephen, you recall I was a SEAL in the system, Senior Education Improvement Leader. I'm interested to find out, has the role of the SEAL changed? It's an important link between schools and the system. I note that in the private school system, they've moved to a system where they have primary school SEALs and secondary school SEALs. I'm just wondering whether there's been any changes to the role of the SEAL in the system, and what's your view in terms of the importance of that role as the link between the system and schools?
That is a complicated question, Brendan.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry.
So no. I'll answer the first part. So I'm not aware of any prescribed, documented change to the role. And I, my experience working with SEALs is, I'll answer this slightly differently. There is a lot of work globally researching the role that's what's often termed a mediating layer. So in any education systems, for lack of a better term, you've got your centre, and then you've got your schools, and then you've got a middle layer, which is regions and areas and clusters and some systems, districts in the US. There's often similar structures where aggregating schools in groups is beneficial in a whole range of ways. That collegiate support, delivering emergency management crisis support, it just makes sense to organise schools in that way. But having that mediating layer, having someone who's able to translate between the experiences and needs and challenges and opportunities in schools and what's happening at a central policy level adds enormous value. Now it can be, you can get it wrong. You can add administrative overhead and compliance, but you can also get it right. So coming back to that previous conversation around professional support, that collegiality, that the benefits of being part of a system, you get it right, and people do feel part of something bigger than their own school, and they get to benefit from all of the exposure to what's happening elsewhere in the system. And I think that's where SEALs play a really critical role. I think one of the real challenges in our system is if I walk into school A and I open the workbook of a Year 5 student, and I walk down the road into school B and open the workbook of a Year 5 student in that school, and the quality of work, the expectations of learning, the alignment with the curriculum expectation and the curriculum standards is different in those schools, then the child in school A who's getting a lesser offering is really missing out. And one of the only ways to overcome that is through exposure to what's happening in School B and enabling those conversations about what do we expect of a Year 5 student, and how can we build a consistent expectation of delivery of that curriculum, so that we're offering an equal education right across the system. Now, SEALs play a really critical role in moderating and mediating those conversations between schools. The other part of it is just the primary-secondary differentiation. So no, I'm not aware of any formalised or documented change in expectation. I do know, however, that our secretary is really interested in making sure that we attend to and differentiate the support according to the different needs and contexts of primary and secondary schools. So that might have come through, some particular conversations, and I think that just affects, the fundamental difference in the way secondary schools are structured relative to primary, some of the industrial context around that, and just making sure, just as we would with any classroom or student, that we're differentiating appropriately. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. And
Thanks.
Mark, do you have a final question there for Stephen?
Yeah, Stephen, thank you so much for today. I know Brendan will be finishing off with a quick update about next week. Just a quick couple of questions, nothing to do with education to finish off. People might like. So let's go with who's someone outside of education who you really admire, and maybe why?
Look, I'm going to go a slightly odd answer, completely outside. So I run a bit, and there's a Norwegian or French Norwegian runner called Kilian Jornet. He's an ultra runner. Basically spends his time running across mountain ridges. He'll head off for 3 or 4 days at a time with an empty water bottle that he'll fill up at mountain streams, and at maybe a few Mars bars, and he'll come back 3 or 4 days later, maybe in getting a few hours sleep here and there in the middle of a Norwegian summer with the midnight sun. And one of the reasons I admire him is just I think it shows what's possible when a human is raised in a particular environment, and the conditioning that's possible with the human body. He a few years ago decided to tackle Everest, and he actually ran up and down it twice in a week. And that is unheard of. And people, mountaineers, spend their lives training for this, and just by virtue of the environment that he's spent his life in and that conditioning, he just kind of ran up and down. Let's do it again. Yeah.
Thanks, including the things you
indicates
saw you run them.
Mark, that Stephen may have just recently competed in the Melbourne Marathon. Is that correct?
It is correct, Brendan. It was terrible. I ran a really good first 25k, and then my legs started cramping up, and I hobbled to the finish line. So yeah.
Totally last question for me, Stephen. Just an easy one. Can you remember the last time you laughed really wholeheartedly?
I can. So my partner has an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I was talking with the 6-year-old about he didn't want to go to his swimming lessons, and I was trying to have a conversation about well, if you learn to swim now, you kind of keep your pathways open. You might want to become a lifesaver, or you might become a diver, or might want to sail ships, and if you can swim, all of those careers are going to be open to you. You got to be something, and this just keeps the pathways open. And he said to me, I don't want to be anything. I want to be nothing. And I said, well, everyone's got to be something. And he said to me, you're not something. You're nothing. But the follow-up, though, so I'm one of those people who got into sourdough baking during COVID and never gave up. So I still do bake bread every weekend. So the follow-up from him was, but you could be something. You could be a baker. So I knew that one day, if I want to be something, I can be a baker.
Thank you, Stephen. Over to Brendan to wrap up today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephen, for being with us today. Highly regarded in the system, and we really do appreciate your responses that you provided for us today. Thank you. Can I finish up by mentioning that the poll is in the chat box, so please make sure you go to the survey before you finish up. And I'd like to mention the last program for the year. The session that we're holding next Wednesday deals with conflict. Chris Darmody is going to run the session. He's accredited workplace mediator, conflict coach, counsellor with the Fair Work Commission, and a trained secondary teacher. He has 20 years history, expanding a range of initiatives, including creative, education, commercial, and government sectors. Chris has worked with a diverse range of people and personalities in different workplace environments to help them understand and negate any negative conflict in their situations. As a trained secondary school teacher, Chris brings both insight and understanding of the education sector to help people in schools and their communities to reframe their relationships when conflicts occur. It's a very important session, and I would highly encourage participants today to tune into the last session for the year. So thank you to everybody for your participation today, and bye for now.